January 17th, 1943. Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The jungle breathed with heat. Thick vines strangled the mahogany trees, and the air hung so heavy with moisture that even standing still felt like drowning. Beneath a canopy that filtered sunlight into dim green twilight, a young Japanese soldier named Corporal Takeshi Yamamoto sat with his back against a fallen log, his uniform in tatters, his rifle long abandoned, his eyes sunken deep into a face that had become a mask of bone and shadow, watched as two American Marines approached through the undergrowth. He did not rise. He could not rise. His legs, swollen with beriberi and wasted by months of starvation, would no longer obey him. The Americans carried their weapons casually, almost carelessly, and when they saw him, they did not shoot. Instead, one of them reached into his pack and produced something Yamamoto had not seen in 7 months. A can of meat, not dried fish, not moldy rice. Meat, sealed in metal, preserved and abundant. The Marine opened it with a small blade attached to his belt, the sound of the can opener cutting through tin, somehow louder than the distant artillery. He handed it to Yamamoto without ceremony, without triumph, and walked away. Yamamoto stared at the can. Inside, pink processed ham glistened with its own juice. The smell made his stomach clench with a pain he had almost forgotten was possible. He had been taught that Americans were soft, decadent, spiritually weak. He had been told they would crumble under the Bushido spirit, that their love of comfort would make them cowards. But the man who had just given him food looked neither soft nor weak. He looked fed. He looked strong. And as Yamamoto brought the first piece of meat to his cracked lips, tasting salt and fat and something impossibly rich, a crack appeared in everything he had believed about the war, about his enemy, and about the empire he had been willing to die for. The Pacific War was not supposed to unfold this way. When Japanese forces swept across Asia in late 1941 and early 1942, they moved with a speed and ferocity that stunned the world. Hong Kong fell in 18 days. Singapore, the great British fortress, surrendered in 70. The Philippines, Wake Island, Guam, all collapsed before the momentum of the Imperial Japanese Army and Navy. The soldiers who carried out these conquests had been forged in a culture that worshipped sacrifice, that elevated suffering to a spiritual virtue, and that promised glory through death. They were told that the Western powers, particularly the Americans, were morally corrupt, obsessed with material pleasure, incapable of enduring hardship. Japanese military training emphasized austerity. Soldiers were expected to survive on minimal rations, to endure pain without complaint, to view hunger not as a weakness but as a test of spirit. Officers received better food than enlisted men, but even their portions were meager by Western standards. A typical Japanese soldier in the field subsisted on rice, pickled vegetables, dried fish, and occasionally tinned meat or biscuits that were reserved for special operations. Daily caloric intake often hovered around 1,500 calories, Pacific, describing enemy supply dumps filled with food, some of it already opened and discarded, waste on a scale that seemed obscene. At Guadalcanal, Japanese forces recaptured areas the Americans had briefly held and discovered crates of canned peaches, condensed milk, coffee, and chocolate. Soldiers who had been eating handfuls of rice and seaweed stared at these treasures, unable to reconcile what they saw with what they had been told. How could an enemy so wasteful, so indulgent be winning? The cognitive dissonance was profound. Some dismissed it as proof of American decadence, evidence that their enemy lacked the discipline to ration properly. But others, especially as the war dragged on and Japanese logistics collapsed, began to see it differently. This was not waste. This was power. A nation that could afford to throw away food was a nation with resources beyond imagination. And a soldier who ate well was a soldier who could fight harder, march longer, and think more clearly than a man starving in the mud. The transformation in perception
accelerated as Japanese soldiers began to be taken prisoner in significant numbers. For the first 2 years of the war, surrender was almost unthinkable. Bushido Code dictated that capture was the ultimate dishonor, worse than death. Soldiers were expected to fight until killed, or to commit suicide, rather than fall into enemy hands. Many did. But as the war turned against Japan, as entire garrisons were cut off and starved, as malaria, dysentery, and beriberi ravaged units already weakened by hunger, more and more men found themselves too sick, too weak, or too isolated to continue fighting. Some were found unconscious. Others staggered out of the jungle, half dead, seeking only water and an end to pain. These men, when they became prisoners of war, entered a world that shattered every assumption they had carried into battle. They expected torture, execution, or at best brutal captivity, mirroring the treatment Japan inflicted on Allied prisoners. What they received instead was medical care, shelter, and food, astonishing quantities of food. The American military, adhering to Geneva Convention standards and motivated by a combination of legal obligation, strategic propaganda value, and genuine humanitarian impulse, fed its prisoners. According to the same basic standards, it fed its own troops. POWs received 3 meals a day. Hot meals. Meals with meat, vegetables, bread, and fruit. Meals that, in both quantity and quality, exceeded anything most of them had eaten even before the war, let alone during it. The initial reaction was disbelief. Many prisoners, too malnourished to process rich food, became physically ill after their first American meal. Their shrunken stomachs rebelled against the sudden intake of protein and fat. Medical officers had to carefully manage the refeeding process, starting with rice porridge and gradually introducing more substantial fare. But even the porridge was prepared with care, seasoned, served warm, accompanied by tea or juice. As the prisoners recovered, as their strength returned and their minds cleared from the fog of starvation, they began to observe. They watched American guards eat the same food they were given, sometimes from the same kitchen. They saw enlisted men, ordinary soldiers, no different in rank from themselves, sitting down to meals that would have been lavish by Japanese officer standards. Roast beef, mashed potatoes, gravy, green beans, white bread with butter, apple pie, coffee with sugar, and condensed milk. These were not special occasions. This was routine, daily, expected, and the Americans, incredibly, sometimes complained about it. Complained that the beef was tough, that the coffee was weak, that they were tired of the same menu. This casual ingratitude, this assumption of abundance, was perhaps more shocking than the abundance itself. It revealed a baseline standard of living, a societal expectation, so far beyond Japanese experience that it seemed almost alien. Idea that the United States fought not from desperation, but from surplus, that it could afford to project power across the world's largest ocean and still maintain a standard of living higher than most nations achieved in peacetime. For Japanese POWs, this realization was devastating and transformative. Many had been indoctrinated since childhood to believe in Japan's divine mission, in the superiority of its culture, in the righteousness of its imperial expansion. The war, they were told, was a struggle against Western colonialism, a fight to liberate Asia from white domination. But how could a liberating power allow its soldiers to starve while the colonizers feasted? How could a superior civilization fail to feed its own men? The contradiction gnawed at them, eroding the foundations of their belief. Some prisoners became deeply depressed, seeing the war as lost, not just militarily, but morally. Others grew angry, feeling betrayed by leaders who had sent them to fight without adequate support. And a few, a small but significant number, began to question the entire ideological structure of the Japanese state, to wonder if democracy, for all its supposed weaknesses, might actually produce better outcomes for ordinary people than military dictatorship. This intellectual and emotional shift was exactly what American psychological warfare officers hoped to encourage. The United States, recognizing the propaganda value of well-treated prisoners, produced films and pamphlets featuring Japanese POWs eating, recovering, even smiling. These materials were distributed in combat zones, dropped from aircraft over Japanese positions, designed to convince starving soldiers that surrender was not only survivable, but preferable to pointless death. The strategy had mixed success. Japanese resistance remained fanatical in many battles, but as the war ground on and conditions worsened, the trickle of surrenders increased, and each man who surrendered and survived carried with him a story that, when the war ended, would circulate through a defeated nation struggling to understand how it had lost. The contrast between Japanese and American food culture extended beyond military logistics into deeper questions of social organization and values. Japan's traditional diet, based on rice, fish, vegetables, and soy products, was nutritionally adequate but monotonous and low in calories by Western standards. Meat was historically scarce, a luxury rather than a staple. Portions were small, meals simple, eating itself viewed more as fuel than as pleasure. This reflected a broader cultural emphasis on frugality, self-discipline, and communal obligation over individual satisfaction. The military intensified these values to the extreme, creating a system where suffering was glorified and comfort despised. American food culture, by contrast, was rooted in abundance. The United States, with its vast agricultural lands and immigrant traditions, had developed a cuisine that celebrated variety, generosity, and the pleasure of eating. Meals were social events. Portions were large. Waste, while not encouraged, was tolerated because there was always more. This was not merely a matter of wealth. It reflected a different philosophy of human life, one that prioritized individual well-being, that believed people should enjoy their existence, that saw happiness